Hi, everybody. A number of people have asked me to put together a short video about the resurrection of Jesus and some of the evidence that we have for it. So I'm going to do that now. Obviously, come back to me, any more questions and things like that. But we're just about to go into Easter Day, which is tomorrow. And we celebrate, Christians across the world celebrate the resurrection of Jesus. And let's make no mistake about it, the resurrection of Jesus is the most important fact in Christianity. If you're looking at this, or if you're talking to someone who is a skeptic and doesn't believe or doesn't want to believe, well, or is on a search, and many people will argue about evolution and creation and whether the Bible is true, all these sorts of things. But look, I just want to save you some time. If you're doing that, if you're going to go on evidence for Christianity type thing, there's only one question you need to ask. And that question is not, is there a God? Or is the Bible true? The question is, did Jesus rise from the dead? And if that is the case, it's true. If it's not the case, it's not true, and you can ignore everything that I say. You can walk past every church building you want to walk past. So, I'm just saying, look, this is the evidence. And for us as Christians, our faith doesn't rest on a feeling that we had in a meeting, or the experience of conversion, or all the lovely people that we know. All these things are great, but our faith doesn't rest on that. And when things go bad, when relationships might be difficult or someone offends us, that shouldn't change our understanding or view of whether the faith is true or not, or whether we keep following Jesus. The most important thing is whether Jesus rose from the dead. So I'm going to go through just some of the evidence. Can't do all of it, of course, and I'm going to recommend books, and I'm going to be open for questions. I just want to mention something about the existence of Jesus first. There are some people who puzzlingly say, well, we don't know whether Jesus existed. Okay, let me just say something. If anybody went to the head of history of any university, anywhere in the world, and asked them a question, did Jesus exist? You'd get a very simple answer from all of them. And the answer would be, yes, he did. Now, I'm not saying they would all believe he was the Son of God or that he rose from the dead bodily, but pretty well, if most heads of history would say that the first Christians, the very first Christians who knew Jesus, who were with him through his death, and they would claim his resurrection, that they believed that Jesus had risen from the dead. You'd get a lot of support for that. And there would be no doubt at all that he was crucified under the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate. The second largest religion in the world, Islam, denies that Jesus died on the cross against every single strand of biblical evidence. So in terms of the existence of Jesus, there are sources outside of the Bible, Jewish historians, Roman historians, as well as many, many Christian sources. In fact, 80% of what we have about Jesus in our four Gospels can be replicated and put together from the evidence from outside of the Gospels. That's interesting, isn't it? Now, I haven't got time in this video to give you all the proof and stuff of that, but there's plenty of good resources. The evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, there's a number of very good articles, 12 evidences, 20 evidences, the top 10 evidences for the resurrection of Jesus. But some comments from me would be that the story doesn't make sense if it wasn't true. There was a guy called J.B. Phillips who wrote a book called The Ring of Truth. And he says there are a number of things in the Gospels which make it highly unlikely that the stories were made up. I'll give you an example. Um, the act of crucifixion. Okay, it was a painful death, but it was also um, the lowest of the low type death. And of course, Muslims pick up on this today, and they say, "How can you worship someone who allowed themselves to be crucified? How could you do that? That's not an impressive person to follow." And to make up a story like that is, it goes against all the things that you want. If you want to make up a new religion, you make up a new religion about the fact that what an amazing, impressive human being this was. You wouldn't talk about him being spat on, ridiculed, mocked, betrayed, etc. So there's things like that, and also the fact that the very first witnesses of Jesus being alive, and certainly in Luke's account, they're given high prominence, were women. Now, back then, as it is now in the Middle East, women's testimony is not regarded as reliable or as good as a man's testimony. Look, don't sort of pick on me for that. I'm not saying that, but that's what was believed at the time. And to have stories about Mary and Martha and whatever coming to the tomb, talking to Jesus, thinking he was the gardener, and then coming back to the disciples and telling their story, that is quite remarkable. And that's an unlikely piece of detail which would not have been included if they were trying to provide the best sort of proof possible. Another interesting thing is that many of the theories that circulate about Jesus, both about him as a person and his life and his death and resurrection, actually give away a bit too much. So, for instance, the biggest opponents of the Christian faith in the early days were the Jews, particularly the Jewish hierarchy. And they said, for instance, Jesus did his miracles by the power of the devil. But what have they given away? What have they admitted? They've admitted that Jesus did miracles. Do you get that? And when it comes to the resurrection, the stories that circulated immediately after the resurrection, some of them come up in the Gospels themselves, but we know from elsewhere that these happened, was that the disciples stole the body. That was one. And it was in fact, the Roman soldiers said that the disciples came and stole the body. Well, how did they know? They said that they were sleeping. Well, how did they know that the disciples came and stole the body if they were sleeping? Some of this stuff just doesn't add up at all. And the number of sources that we have, number of witnesses and sources of evidence, is really quite wide. So, for instance, Paul, in the earliest account of the resurrection, and it's in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul talks about 500 people witnessed Jesus alive after he had died. Then you've got Matthew, who was very close to Jesus. You've got Mark, who we are told tells us Peter's story. Peter was very close to Jesus. We have Luke, who he informs us at the beginning of his gospel, he talked to the eyewitnesses themselves. Many of them were women, and he gives their accounts in his gospel. And John, he was close to Jesus as well. You've then got Peter's letters in the New Testament. He said, "We did not follow cleverly invented stories when we told you about the power and coming of the Lord Jesus Christ." Didn't make it up. John says in his letter, he says, "Look, we've seen this life. We've seen him. We've touched him. We've handled him. He is the word of truth." Just talking about the reality of Jesus's existence. And Luke says that he consulted those who were eyewitnesses to put together an orderly account for the recipient of his gospel, as it would become known, a guy called Theophilus. So you've got all these sorts of things building up. And those accounts are independent. We're not talking about all telling exactly the same story. In fact, some of the differences, if you read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, and look at the resurrection stories, there are slight differences. And these are differences of perspective. These are differences because someone was looking at it from a different angle, or only noticed one thing. So, for instance, one says that there were two men in white in the tomb. Another person says there was only one. Well, he doesn't actually say there was only one. He only tells us about one. But all these little differences make up a real weight of truth, a real weight of evidence, which feels far truer than the skeptics would say. Another interesting thing is that when the apostles, the first believers, saw Jesus, of course, he commissioned them then to go into all the world and tell everybody that he was alive and that he's now Lord and all this sort of thing. And they did. And we have some amazing accounts. Some of them are in the Bible. Most are in early history and early accounts from the first and the second centuries of Andrew being killed on an X-shaped cross. And to this day, the Scottish cross is called St. Andrew's Cross. Peter crucified upside down. And his tomb you can go to see his tomb in Rome. Thomas was killed in India. And to this day, there's a community of people who follow Thomas and dedicate their church building to him. Matthew was killed. Mark was killed in Egypt, Alexandria. It's pretty certain that most of the first 12 disciples were martyred, were killed for their faith. I've been to the place where John was kept in prison, the Isle of Patmos, and he was there for many years, working in the mines. Difficult place to be. But if you were an eyewitness, or if you made it up, would you die for it? The answer is, of course not. And this is different now to people who kill themselves because they believe something is true. They don't know if it's true. So someone like a suicide bomber might believe that their religion is right, and they kill themselves. So you could say, well, the religion must be right because they killed themselves. No, they never saw the prophet. They weren't there when these things happened. They just believe it. Imagine if the disciples knew that they all made it up and it was all a bit of a game. You just wouldn't stand there and be speared to death. And there are no accounts from the first century or the early second century showing that any of the disciples denied their faith or said that Jesus hadn't risen from the dead. Besides that, there are a number of experts who've looked at the evidence. So let me show you this. It's probably upside down for you, or back to front. Who Moved the Stone by Frank Morrison. Now, Frank Morrison, this was written in the 30s. Frank Morrison was a barrister, someone used to evidence and dealing with all these sorts of things. And he set out to disprove Christianity, to particularly disprove the fact that Jesus rose from the dead. Halfway through the book, he was convinced that Jesus had risen from the dead. So the purpose of the book was changed, this time to show the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. Other people have done something similar. So a guy called Val Grieve, who was a Queen's counsellor, a real top barrister, top lawyer, he did the same thing. He set out to disprove the resurrection of Jesus, ended up converting and became a Christian, and his small book is still available. Then there was a guy called Lee Strobel. Lee was an investigative journalist, very skeptical sort of guy. And he set out to disprove the resurrection of Jesus and even the existence of Jesus. Well, his books and a film made about that are out and are very, very good. And I really encourage you to have a look at those. And then there was a chap called Josh McDowell, who was a very skeptical student, and he wrote a book, the first edition of this, Evidence That Demands a Verdict. And this is the latest edition, written with his son, Josh McDowell. Yeah. So they set out to disprove Christianity, or he set out to disprove Christianity, and in the end was converted. It gets a bit of a regular story now of people who set out to disprove it and are fair and look at the evidence for themselves. They end up becoming Christians, believing Jesus is alive and following him for the rest of their lives. So, okay, I'm going to finish my bit on that. But let me just say a few things about other material. There's a really good book by a chap called Hank Hanegraaff called Resurrection. You can get that if you look it up. You can probably order it on the web or go into any local bookshop, Christian bookshop, and ask for it. My apologies about my phone. This then is Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, and this is a bigger book by a top scholar called Richard Bauckham, and he looks at the evidence for Jesus and the plausibility of the New Testament accounts. Do they sound true? Yeah. And then finally this one, which is a whopper, The Resurrection of the Son of God by N.T. Wright. And this looks at the meaning of the resurrection and some of the evidence as well. It's worth checking out. But if you can't cope with very big books, don't read that one. And there's plenty of other good material. There's stuff on the web, some super videos. If any of you email me or contact me, I can send you the links for those. We have no reason to be embarrassed about the resurrection of Jesus. We have no reason to think, oh dear, how do we know it's true? No matter what people say, we can be very, very confident that what we believe is plausible, what we believe fits with the evidence that we have. Most people who will criticize the Christian faith will not even have read the Gospels. So don't feel embarrassed or difficult about this. I'm a Christian because it's true, not because I want it to be true, not because I feel it's true. I'm a Christian because it is true, and you should be too. Okay, I'm going to finish. Tomorrow is Easter Day, and I trust all of you will have at least a slightly more strengthened faith in the fact that Jesus, when he died, that was not the end. He came back from the dead, and it was a bodily resurrection. It wasn't come back as a ghost. It was a bodily resurrection, and he is alive today. And he commands everybody to turn away from their way that they're living, acknowledge him as the Lord, the boss of their life. I extend that invitation to anybody who looks at this video. It's the best way to live, and it's true. Thanks very much.